The night my brother-in-law decided to make me his dinner entertainment, I was wearing a cardigan I'd owned for 6 years. It wasn't falling apart. It wasn't stained, it was just a cardigan. Cream, slightly pillowed at the elbows, the kind of thing you reach for without thinking because it's comfortable, and you've washed it so many times it feels like a second skin. I remember standing in front of the mirror that afternoon, looking at myself and thinking, it's fine. It's just family. That thought. It's just family. I've spent a lot of time since then thinking about how dangerous those 3 words can be. My husband's name is Joel. We've been married 4 years at that point, together for 7. He teaches 8th grade history at a public school in Raleigh, and he loves it in the way that only people who are genuinely called to something can love it. He talks about his students at dinner. He stays late to write recommendation letters. He spent $200 of his own money 1 year buying books for a kid whose family couldn't afford them, and he never mentioned it to anyone. I only found out because the receipt fell out of his jacket pocket. Joel is a good man. I want to make sure I say that clearly, because what I'm about to tell you will make you wonder, and the answer is yes, he is. He just made a mistake that night that took us a long time to come back from. His sister, my sister-in-law, had been dating someone new. His name was Rhett with 2 T's, which he mentioned, unprompted, within the first 4 minutes of meeting him. He was in private equity, based out of Charlotte, and he wore a watch that I recognized immediately as a Patek Philippe. I know what that watch costs. I didn't say anything. The dinner was at my mother-in-law's house in Cary. She hosts every few months, a big family meal, everyone together, her famous pot roast and the good tablecloth she irons herself. It's the kind of evening that looks warm from the outside and feels like walking a tightrope from the inside, at least for me. Joel's family has never been cruel. They've just always been quietly certain of where everyone stands. And where I stood in their mind was, sweet girl, average job, lucky to have our son. I work in real estate, or I should say, I have worked in real estate in one way or another since I was 24 years old, but that night, as far as anyone at that table knew, I was a mid-level property manager at a small firm downtown. That was the version of me they had, and I had never offered them anything different. We sat down around 6:30. Rhett chose a seat across from me, which I think was accidental, but sometimes I'm not sure. It started small, the way these things always do. My mother-in-law asked Rhett about his work, and he was off. Private equity, portfolio companies, a deal he just closed in Nashville that he described in the kind of detail that makes it clear he expects everyone at the table to be impressed and also slightly confused. I watched my sister-in-law beam. I watched Joel nod politely. I cut my pot roast into smaller pieces and said nothing. Then Rhett looked at me. Joel said you're in property management? The word property management came out of his mouth the way someone might say data entry or filing. Something like that, I said. Which firm? I told him. He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that isn't a nod at all. I think I've heard of them. Small operation, right? Mostly residential? Mostly, I said. Tough market for the smaller shops, he said. A lot of consolidation happening. You've probably been feeling that. I had, though not in the way he meant. We manage, I said. Something shifted in his face. A small smile. I'm sure you do. Joel put his hand on my knee under the table. A gentle pressure. Let it go. I know that's what he meant. And I did let it go. I picked up my fork and let the conversation move on, and Rhett's attention traveled to my brother-in-law and some story about golf, and I sat there in my 6-year-old cardigan, and I let it go. But then dessert came. My mother-in-law had made apple pie. She was cutting slices, and my sister-in-law was talking about a vacation she and Rhett were planning. Tuscany, 2 weeks. A villa with a private pool. And the conversation turned, the way it sometimes does in families, into an accidental competition. Everyone contributing their last trip, their next trip, their wish list. Joel mentioned we'd been thinking about Portland, just a long weekend. Rhett looked at me with something close to sympathy. Portland's great, he said. Very accessible. He said accessible the same way he'd said property management. It's on our list, I said. "You two should really try Europe sometime," he said. "Opens your perspective. I know it can feel like a stretch on a teacher's salary." He glanced at Joel. "But there are ways to make it work. Budget airlines, off-season rates. Honestly, it's more doable than people think." The table was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then my mother-in-law said, "That's a lovely idea," and started passing the pie, and that was that. Joel didn't say anything. I looked at him. He was looking at his plate. I didn't sleep that night, not because Rhett had hurt my feelings. That's the part that's hard to explain. It wasn't the comments themselves. I'd heard variations of them my whole life in different rooms from different people. What kept me awake was the realization that Joel had heard them too, and stayed quiet, and that I didn't know what that meant about us. I lay in the dark, and I thought about the very first property I ever purchased. I was 26, a duplex in Durham, not far from downtown, the kind of block that the rest of the world hadn't noticed yet, but that I'd studied obsessively for 2 years. I scraped together the down payment myself, a combination of savings from my first job, a small inheritance from my grandmother that I'd never touched, and a personal loan from a credit union that gave me a slightly better rate than the bank's. I did not tell anyone, not my parents, not my friends, not the man I was dating at the time who later became my husband. I didn't tell them because I was terrified. And I didn't tell them because some quiet part of me already knew that if I said it out loud and it failed, I wouldn't survive the "I told you so." Not all families say those words. Some of them just go silent in a particular way, and you feel them anyway. That duplex did not fail. I rented both units within 3 weeks. The cash flow was small at first, barely $200 a month after expenses, but it was real. It was mine. And something happened to me in the weeks after I bought it, something I didn't have a name for then. I started seeing differently. Every block I drove down, every neighborhood I passed through, I was calculating. What's the median rent? What are prices doing? What does the street look like in 5 years? I bought the second property 14 months later, a single-family home in a neighborhood that was just beginning to turn. I house-hacked it for 2 years, lived in one room and rented out the others, which Joel found slightly chaotic when we started dating, but accepted with the grace of someone who genuinely trusts the person they love. By the time we got married, I had 5 units. By the time Rhett sat across from me at that dinner table, I had 23. 23 units, 11 properties, and 4 counties across North Carolina. Joel knew I had some rental properties. He knew in the way that a person knows a fact they haven't fully integrated, the way you know a city's population without ever really picturing that many people. He knew I had a few places. He knew there was a separate account. He knew I spent weekend mornings sometimes on the phone with contractors or reviewing leases. He just didn't know the shape of it, and that was my fault. I told myself over the years that there were good reasons for this, that I didn't want our finances to get complicated, that I was waiting until things were more stable, that I'd tell him when there was something concrete to tell. But lying there that night, unable to sleep, I finally admitted something I'd been avoiding for a long time. I had kept it from him because I was afraid of what he would do with the information. Not Joel specifically. Just people. When people know what you have, they start relating to what you have instead of who you are. I'd watched it happen to others. I didn't want to watch it happen to us. But what I had done instead, without meaning to, was build a wall. And Rhett's comments that night weren't what broke something. They were just the light that illuminated what was already broken. In the morning, Joel made coffee. He brought me a cup and sat down across from me at the kitchen table, and he said, "Last night I should have said something." "Yes," I said, "you should have." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. "Is there anything you want to tell me?" It took me a long time to answer. Not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because I'd held it for so long that releasing it felt like opening a door I'd kept locked so carefully I'd almost forgotten why. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love about him. He just listened. His coffee went cold. When I finished, he sat back in his chair, and I watched his face move through things I couldn't quite name. "How many units?" he finally said. 23. He nodded slowly. Then, very quietly, "Why didn't you tell me?" It's the question I'd been asking myself all night. I was afraid, I said. Not of you, just of what knowing would change. He thought about that for a while. Would you have told me? Eventually? I think I was always going to, I said. I just kept waiting for the right moment, and the right moment never felt right. And Rhett has nothing to do with this, I said. Rhett just reminded me that the wall I built to protect us was also keeping you out. We didn't solve everything that morning. We talked for a long time about trust, about fear, about the version of me I'd been presenting to his family and why. He told me he'd felt for years a low hum of something he couldn't name, like I was always slightly further away than he could reach. Now he understood why. It wasn't a clean conversation. There were things he said that stung, and things I said that I had to walk back. But we stayed at that table until the coffee was cold and the light through the kitchen window had shifted from morning to afternoon, and by the end of it, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time, like I was standing in the same room as my own life. 3 weeks later, my sister-in-law called. She'd heard something, she didn't say from whom, but I had my guesses. One of my properties had recently been written up in the local commercial real estate newsletter, the kind of publication that only people in the industry actually read. Somehow it had found its way to someone who knew someone. My sister-in-law had a screenshot. She was calling, she said, to catch up. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing. Then she said, "So, I didn't realize you had your own business." "It's not really a business," I said, which was a lie. "It absolutely is a business. Properties," she said. The way she said it, it sounded like she was trying the word on for size. "I've been buying and renting residential real estate for about 9 years," I said. "It's been going well." There was a pause. Rhett mentioned the other night that he'd been thinking about getting into real estate investing. He was going to ask if you had any advice. I thought about the word accessible. I thought about budget airlines. "Tell him I'm happy to talk," I said. "He can reach out any time." He never did. The next family dinner was about a month later. It was smaller, just the immediate family, no Rhett. He and my sister-in-law had apparently had some kind of falling out. No one said exactly what happened, and I didn't ask. He wasn't there. That was enough. What had changed, though, was everything else. My mother-in-law asked me, early in the evening, about a neighborhood she'd been hearing about. She had a friend thinking about selling her house and wanted to know if it was a good time. I talked with her for 20 minutes. She listened to me in a way she never had before, leaning slightly forward, asking follow-up questions. At some point, I realized my father-in-law had put down his phone and was listening too. Joel caught my eye across the table and smiled. It wasn't a triumphant smile. That's not who he is. It was more like, "There you are." Like he was seeing me clearly for the first time, or maybe like I was finally letting him. "I don't have a clean moral to offer you. I made mistakes. I kept things from my husband for years, and even if I had reasons I believed in, the cost was real. He deserved to know who he'd married. Not the version I'd decided was safe to show. The full version. The one who lies awake running numbers. The one who's loud something close to joy the first time she signed a closing disclosure on her own. The one who wanted, more than almost anything, to be seen for what she built, but was too afraid to let anyone actually look. Rhett wasn't the villain of this story. He was just a mirror. An unflattering one, held up at the worst possible angle, but a mirror. What I saw in it wasn't him. It was me, standing at the edge of my own life, holding myself back with both hands. I own 31 units now. We have a shared spreadsheet. Joel looks at it sometimes on Sunday mornings, with his coffee, and asks questions about things he doesn't understand, and I explain them, and he nods and asks more questions, and it is one of the most ordinary and precious things in my life. Last month my mother-in-law asked if I'd be willing to help her friend, the one with the house. She handed me the phone, and the woman on the other end was nervous and a little lost, and I spent 45 minutes walking her through what to expect, what to watch for, what questions to ask her agent. When I hung up, my mother-in-law looked at me for a moment. "You're really good at this," she said. "Not, I didn't know you were good at this. Just, you're really good at this." I've been thinking about the difference ever since. I've thought a lot about what actually changed that night. not Rhett's comments. Those were just noise, the kind that fades once you leave the room. What changed was that I finally stopped pretending the wall I built was only facing outward. I told myself for years that keeping my finances private was a form of protection. Protection from envy, from interference, from the way people start looking at you differently once they know you have something. And those fears weren't irrational. I'd watched it happen to others. I'd seen friendships quietly curl after someone came into money. I knew what it felt like to be sized up before being taken seriously, so I kept quiet and I called it strategy, and I didn't examine it too closely. What I hadn't let myself see was that the same wall keeping strangers out was also keeping Joel in the dark. And that's not protection. That's just fear wearing a sensible coat. The thing about cautiousness is that it rarely stays contained. I was careful with my real estate. I was careful with my savings. I was careful with my words at family dinners, careful not to draw attention, careful to take up exactly as much space as everyone had already decided was appropriate for me. After a while, careful becomes a habit that runs deeper than any single decision. It becomes the shape of how you move through the world. Rhett didn't create that in me. He just lit up a room I'd been avoiding. And what I found once I finally walked into it, once I sat across from Joel at our kitchen table and said the actual numbers out loud, told him about the duplex in Durham, the sleepless nights reviewing leases, the 2 times I came close to losing everything and said nothing, was that the thing I'd been protecting myself from had already happened. He had felt it, that low hum he described, the sense of something just out of reach. I'd been so focused on guarding the door that I hadn't noticed he could feel the draft coming through it. There is a kind of integrity that lives in the overlap between who you are in private and who you allow people to see. I had almost none of it in my marriage, despite thinking of myself as an honest person. I was honest about small things. I was honest when it was easy, but the real, complicated, unfinished version of me, the one who was still afraid, still calculating, still not entirely sure she deserved what she'd built, that one I kept tucked away, and I think that version is actually the one worth knowing. What I want, if I'm being honest now, is to be the kind of person whose private life and public life cost roughly the same to enter. Not because I owe anyone access to everything I've worked for. I don't. But because the people who love you deserve to love the real thing. Joel still brings me coffee on Sunday mornings. He still asks questions about the spreadsheet that I have to walk him through slowly. Last week he asked what cap rate meant, and I explained it, and he nodded, and then he said, "You're really good at this, you know." Not surprised. Not performing admiration, just stating a fact he'd finally been given the information to see. I think that's what I was waiting for all along. Not for someone to be impressed, just for someone to actually look.